has remained more or less the case ever since. But this is combined with an extremely strong and ubiquitous state. The state is everywhere in China. I mean, its leading firms, many of them are still publicly owned. Private firms, however large they are, like Lenovo, depend in many ways on state patronage. Targets for the economy and so on are set by the state. And the state, of course, its authority flows into lots of other areas, as we're familiar with something like the one-child policy. Moreover, this is a very old state tradition, a very old tradition of statecraft. I mean, if you want an illustration of this, the Great Wall is one. But this is another. This is the Grand Canal, which was constructed in the first instance in the 5th century BC and was finally completed in the 7th century AD. It went for 1,114 miles, linking Beijing with Hangzhou and Shanghai. So there's a long history of extraordinary state infrastructural projects in China, which I suppose helps us to explain what we see today, which is something like the Three Gorges Dam and many other expressions of state competence within China. So there we have three building blocks for trying to understand the difference that is China. The civilization state, the notion of race, and the nature of the state in its relationship to society. And yet we still insist, by and large, in thinking that we can understand China by simply drawing on Western experience, looking at it through Western eyes, using Western concepts. If you want to know why we unerringly seem to get China wrong, our predictions about what's going to happen to China are incorrect, this is the reason. Unfortunately, I have to say, that I think our attitude towards China is that of a kind of little Westerner mentality. You know, it's kind of arrogant. It's arrogant in the sense that we think that we are best and therefore we have the universal measure. And secondly, it's ignorant. We refuse to really address the issue of difference. You know, there's a very, very interesting passage in a book by Paul Cohen, the American historian. And Paul Cohen argues that the West thinks of itself as probably the most cosmopolitan of all cultures. But it's not. In many ways, it's the most parochial. Because for 200 years, the West has been so dominant in the world that it's not really needed to understand other cultures, other civilizations, because at the end of the day, it could, if necessary by force, get its own way. Whereas those cultures, virtually the rest of the world, in fact, which have been in a far weaker position vis-à-vis the West, have been thereby forced to understand the West because of the West's presence in those societies. And therefore, they are, as a result, more cosmopolitan in many ways than the West. I mean, take the question of East Asia. East Asia, Japan, Korea, China, etc. A third of the world's population lives there. Now the largest economic region in the world. And I'll tell you now, that East Asians, the people from East Asia, are far more knowledgeable about the West than the West is about East Asia. Now this point is very germane, I'm afraid, to the present. Because what's happening, back to that chart at the beginning, the Goldman Sachs chart. What is happening is that very rapidly, in historical terms, the world is being driven and shaped, not by the old developed countries, but by the developing world. I mean, we've seen this in terms of the G20 usurping very rapidly the position of the G7 or the G8. And there are two consequences of this. First, the West is rapidly losing its influence in the world. There was a dramatic illustration of this, actually, a year ago, Copenhagen, Climate Change Conference. Europe was not at the final negotiating table. When did that last happen? I would wager it was probably about 200 years ago. And that is what is going to happen in the future. And the second implication is that the world will inevitably, as a consequence, become increasingly unfamiliar to us. because it will be shaped by cultures and experiences and histories that we are not really familiar with or conversant with. And alas, I'm afraid, take Europe, America is slightly different, but Europeans, by and large, I have to say, are ignorant, are unaware about the way the world is changing. Some people, I've got a friend, an English friend in China, and he said, the continent is sleepwalking into oblivion. Well, maybe that's true, maybe that's an exaggeration. But there's another problem which goes along with this lack of, that Europe is increasingly out of touch with the world, and that is a sort of a loss of a sense of the future. I mean, Europe was once, of course, commanded the future in its confident, take the 19th century, for example. But this, alas, is no longer true. If you want to feel the future, if you want to taste the future, try China, says old Confucius. This is a railway station, the like of which you've never seen before. It doesn't even look like a railway station. This is the new Guangzhou railway station for the high-speed trains. China already has more of the bigger network than any